Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out again on another beautiful Friday evening to our Young Society presentation. And my name is Ann Taylor. Most of you know me. I'm the newsletter editor and have been associated for the past few years with the Young Society. And so tonight, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. John Van Eenwyk to the Young Society. Some of you may have heard him speak before. And he is a graduate of the C.G. Jung Society in Zurich, and he holds a doctorate from the University of Chicago, a very notable feat. John is an ordained Episcopalian priest. He's the clinical instructor at the University of Washington School of Medicine, and the clinical director of the International Trauma Treatment Program, which he founded in 1998 to train counselors in the treatment of complex trauma survivors. And he has a private practice in Olympia, right here in Washington. Within our library, there are a couple books, and he's very well published, but just a couple examples. Clinical Chaos, The Strange Attractors of Childhood Trauma is in our library here. Archetypes and Strange Attractors, The Chaotic World of Symbols. So if you're interested, you might want to check those out. And just one more quick announcement before we begin the session this evening is that you may have read in the newsletter that we are conducting a raffle, and Kelly is at the back table and can give you further information. But the winning tickets will be drawn at the Sandplay event that we are co-hosting with Sonu Shamdasamy in June. So be sure to check that out. And now please help me welcome Dr. John Van Eenwyk.
So I really appreciate your coming here to find some of the scientific aspects of what we study in Jungian psychology. Tonight, we're going to be looking primarily, actually this whole weekend and tomorrow, at active imagination. And active imagination is something we're all familiar with, and we've probably all read Robert Johnson's book, Inner Work, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. But one of the problems that I've always had in my life is that I've never really been able to take things very seriously. And I found that active imagination was always presented to me as something very serious that you did, with a great deal of ritual and a great deal of dedication. And I'm beginning to discover that it's a lot more than that. And what to me active imagination is about is indulging that area of the mind, of the psyche, if you will, that Jung referred to as the psychoid. And we'll get into that in just a second. Can we have the next slide? But first, I just want to show this. I always show this before a PowerPoint presentation. The devil is talking to one of his minions, and he says, I need someone well-versed in the art of torture. Do you know PowerPoint? And for any of us who've been to presentations like these awful continuing education things we have to go to, where the person puts a slide up and reads it, and then puts another slide up and reads it, and after about 3 slides, we're just screaming to get out of there and not have to do any of this. So unfortunately, we will have a PowerPoint presentation, and you're going to have to suffer through it, because one of the things I have done in my career is worked a lot with torture survivors. So I'm actually well-versed in the art of torture, and I can't stop doing it. Could we have the next slide? This is a quotation that's often attributed to Einstein. It may or may not actually be something he ever said, but I like it anyway. And it says, I never came upon any of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking. And I think that's true. I think that's true for all of us, that we think rationally, but where the real discoveries come from is somewhere else other than our rationality, when suddenly a connection is made or a thought appears to us or something like that. And that's what we're really interested in with regard to this thing that Jung referred to as the psychoid. Now, when we talk about the relationship between the ego and the unconscious, Jung kind of described the relationship between the ego and the collective unconscious as the ego being a cork that bobs on the surface of the ocean, which is the collective unconscious. Just to give an idea of what we're really working with here, the unconscious is not a small subset of the mind. The unconscious is really the mind as a whole, and the ego is just one small part of it. And so I was looking for a quotation that would kind of epitomize that, and I'm a real Joseph Conrad fan. I love Joseph Conrad. I've read everything he's ever written, I think. And here's a quotation that when the first time I read it, I was just stunned. And to me, this is the epitome of the presumptuousness of the ego with regard to the unconscious. And we live in an era now where the presumptuousness of ego-oriented psychotherapy, for example, takes very little into account with regard to the unconscious, but yet seems to be coming out more and more and more. And we'll get into that. This is from The Heart of Darkness. I'm sure all of you had to read it in high school, which is too bad. Read it again. It's much better when you're an adult. In fact, Heart of Darkness is part of a Conradian trilogy. He wrote 3 books. The first was called Youth, and you must read that. It's marvelous, about what we're like when we're young, and the story is about a ship that sinks. And the third mate, who's a young kid, is in one of the lifeboats, and the captain is in one of the other lifeboats, and then the first mate is in the third lifeboat. And the captain says, now we're all going to stay together here because it's really dangerous. We got 1,000 miles if we're going to get to land, you know. And the kid is like, no, I'm going to be the first one there. And he starts racing everybody on. And Conrad keeps going, youth, youth, remember what it was like when we were young. You know, it's marvelous. Well, then Heart of Darkness is middle age, where we suddenly realize, whoa, you know, things are a lot different than we thought they were, and they're kind of horrific. And then the last one, which is old age, is called The End of the Tether, which is about a man who's on his last voyage because he wants to make his money so he can send it to his daughter who's married a ne'er-do-well in Australia. And meanwhile, the owner of the boat's on the boat, and he wants to scuttle it for the insurance. It's fabulous about how life tends to unravel on us as we get older. But this is from Heart of Darkness. Once, I remember, we came upon a man of war anchored off the coast. There wasn't even a shed there, and she was shelling the bush. Man of war being one of those warships, a sailboat with cannons. It appears the French had one of their wars going on thereabouts. Wonderful phrase. Her ensign dropped limp like a rag. The muzzles of the long 6-inch guns stuck out all over the low hull. The greasy, slimy swell swung her up lazily and let her down, swaying her thin masts. In the empty immensity of earth, sky, and water, there she was, incomprehensible, firing into a continent. Pop would go one of the 6-inch guns. A small flame would dart and vanish. A little white smoke would disappear. A tiny projectile would give a feeble screech, and nothing happened. Nothing could happen. There was a touch of insanity in the proceeding, a sense of lugubrious drollery in sight, and it was not dissipated by somebody on board assuring me earnestly there was a camp of natives, he called them enemies, hidden out of sight. And that's just a magnificent example of the presumptuousness of the ego in regard to the unconscious. This small boat firing into the bush of Africa, the huge, huge continent of Africa. So what we're concerned with tonight is that area of the psyche where matter, the stuff of us, converts into psyche, where matter essentially transcends itself, where matter becomes involved in things that sound very much like consciousness, but we don't really have any idea of what the consciousness could possibly be, of what it's doing. And I'll give you some examples. And that's the psychoid layer of the psyche. That's what Jung's talking about when he talks about psyche. It's kind of concerned with how the psyche functions before the ego is even up and running, and we'll talk a bit about that. So we're going to look at how the laws of physics connect with all of this. And of course, as you all know, I'm really into chaos theory, and there's a formula we're going to look at that will actually give us a sense of what we're doing here and how to do it more. Can we have the next slide? This is from Jung. The psychoid unconscious includes things which are not capable of consciousness and are only quasi-psychic. So the psychoid unconscious concludes things which are not capable of consciousness. Consciousness cannot grasp these. You know, in German there are these two words for understanding. One is begriffen, which means to grasp, sort of like the French comprendre, to take hold of. And the other is verstehen, which is a little like our understanding. Verstehen is to stand in the midst of. And what we try to do in Jungian analysis a lot is to stand in the midst of things that we cannot grasp. And in so doing, form a dynamic relationship with them that transforms us and transforms them. The next one is the collective unconscious cannot be directly perceived or represented. And on account of its irrepresentable nature, I have called it psychoid. Now, Jung doesn't say much about psychoid in his writings, just a little bit, but it's really the core of everything he's talking about, which is why I'm bringing it to you tonight, because it's really the core of Jungian analysis. It's the realm where physiology and psychology engage one another. It's the realm where body engages mind, where soma engages psyche. And the psychoid realm is where matter seems to have a mind of its own. Can we have the next slide? Now, for those of you who have seen the YouTube video of the presentation I did this 2 years ago down in Portland, you'll remember this slide. This is a very interesting slide. This is an antibody. We all know about antibodies. You get sick, your immune system adapts to the sickness. Your immune system gets to the point where it can identify it in the future. So if that same pathogen comes into your body again, it's up and running and it dispatches it very quickly. This is the whole basis for inoculations. Smallpox, you get a little bit of smallpox, your immune system learns how to deal with the smallpox. If you actually are exposed to smallpox, boom, it takes care of it. And we've actually, at this point in the world, except in a couple of small laboratories, eliminated smallpox. It doesn't exist anymore. But there are two domains here. There's this domain here, and there are these domains up here. Now, what happens to B cells are these cells in the blood system that are always circulating. When a pathogen, and a pathogen is something that is going to make us sick, comes into the body, the B cells begin to release these B cell receptors, which then, this part of the receptor up here, hypermutates at an extraordinary rate. The chemicals just go, 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 and they're going from one chemical to another chemical until they unlock the key to the pathogen. And essentially what they do is they engage the pathogen. And in engaging the pathogen, and call it an antigen here, it activates this part of the B cell receptor, or of the antibody, and this then sends out messages to the rest of the immune system, what we call the innate immune system, the macrophages, the natural killer cells, the leukocytes, this kind of stuff, to come and dispatch this whole thing. Now that's pretty extraordinary. That's actually more than we can do consciously. Now, one of the other interesting things is that when organisms go under threat, and we're talking about microorganisms here, protozoa, viruses, well, not so much viruses, but bacteria, this kind of thing. When they become under threat, they have to meet the threat in some way that mobilizes their defenses. How do they do this? How do they know what to do? They hypermutate. One of the things we found is that all organisms, when they are under threat, their biology hypermutates. In other words, there's mutation after mutation after mutation until suddenly an adaptation occurs that allows the organism to neutralize the threat. Now, we didn't know this actually until about a year ago, that this is what happened. We thought that mutations were random, Every now and then one would come along. We knew about prions. You've probably heard of prions. Some people call them prions. These are proteins that fold incorrectly. And in folding incorrectly, sometimes produce material and dynamics that are more adaptive for the organism than if they had folded appropriately. So if I'm losing you all right now, believe me, this is complex stuff. This is stuff that has taken, well, at this point, how many years of human history? 6,000, 7,000 years for us to be able to do it. And we're now really getting the chemical signatures on these things. So the question we have with regard to the psychoid is, who's doing this? Who or what is doing this? I mean, do these things think? I mean, do they analyze the situation and come up with a solution? Yes. But who is doing it? Well, that's what we're interested in, because the same thing is going on in us all the time. So we think we're thinking, and I think I'm thinking here, although at my age I realize I'm thinking less and less all the time, even though I don't realize it. But what is actually doing the thinking that's producing my thinking? You begin to kind of get very fractal about this and kind of go a little crazy, which is the whole point. So the psychoid realm is the whole point of Jungian analysis. And what I'm interested in with regard to the psychoid realm, and that's what clinical chaos is all about, is morphogenesis. I'm very, very interested in morphogenesis. Morphogenesis basically means the generation of shape. So morphogenesis is the way in which a sperm cell and an egg cell come together, and 9 months later out comes a human being. How does that happen? Well, we know it happens, and we know the chemical signatures of it, but why? How? It's very mysterious. So what we're really interested in at the moment is brain structure. Maybe it's in the brain. Okay, so let's look at the brain. Let's take a look at the brain here. Okay, here's a brain. And now we don't even talk about the brain anymore. We talk about the connectome. Because the brain operates by connecting with elements inside itself. What we produce as thought is actually a dynamic. And the various parts of the brain, you've probably seen brain scans and that sort of thing, the various parts of the brain create dynamics, and those dynamics are what constitutes hearing, seeing, touching, tasting, smelling, thinking, not thinking, the whole 9 yards. So what's the relationship between brain and mind? How does the brain produce mind? Now, this is what we're interested in Jungian psychology. How does diverse function arise from an apparently static neuronal architecture? I mean, the neurons and everything, they're static. They just sit there, but they produce all of this stuff that we're doing here. So we're going to show a couple of slides of how this happens. Can we have the next one? This is the socialist brain of a liberal Democrat. So we can see, for example, that this is the raise taxes reflex center here. This is the collectivist network center here. This is the embedded groupthink microchip. This is the victim gland here. And we have the Che Guevara area, the bleeding heart, swelling, concern for not taxing the rich enough. This is how the socialist brain organizes itself. So we can say, okay, fine, but there's a problem here, because what it's saying is these are discrete areas. Could we have the next slide? So we can compare it with the brain of a conservative Republican and see if there are any differences here. And if we observe the differences, then we get a sense of how the brains actually work. So we have envy of those who are better off molecule over here, the self-interest cluster over here, the keep what you earn area here, the math particle, which of course we love math, and that's the math particle right there. The unable to count other people's money or keep count of personal acquaintances by ethnicity and race. First and Second Amendment alert sensors, that kind of a thing. So you can actually begin to get to see how the brain works by seeing how the people are who have the brains. Could we have the next one? Now, I'm a sailor, and I love to sail, and I found that they had my brain here. Here's the diesel damn thee to hell part of the brain. It's a huge one, I fucking hate you, F-O-O-K. Please start, please start. This is the water depth part of the brain. This is the rum area of the brain. This is a great area of the brain if you're not familiar with it. It's a delightful one to explore. This is the through the hole around this pole part of the brain, which is, a boat is a hole in the water into which you pour money, that kind of a thing. So, and if you think about all of this, it really comes to the next slide. This is what the brain really looks like, a big mass of hamburger. And that's what it really is, actually. The brain is really a big mass of hamburger. It's just a big mass of stuff. And if you look at it here, there are no discrete areas. And the relationships among the various parts of the hamburger are what produce thought in the brain. Here's a quotation from an article, a book called Images of Mind in the Scientific American Library. The mental activities surrounding consciousness, perception, and thought are the result of columns of neurons stacked next to each other, forming elemental structures that function as a unit, with multiple assemblies of such units within the brain working together as a network of distributed, sometimes recursively connected, interacting brain regions with different areas making specific and often task-modulated activities. So structure and function are in relationship with each other. And one of the things that functional MRIs have revealed about the dream are these four things. One, neural representations are widely distributed within and across brain regions. The old idea that this part of the brain is for seeing, this part of the brain is for thinking, this part of the brain under here is for being afraid, this part of the brain here, hippocampus is for remembering stuff. Neural processes depend on dynamic interactions between regions. Thought and everything the brain does is a function of interaction. It's a function of relationship, not of location. These interactions vary systematically by cognitive state. And finally, the space of possible interactions has high dimensionality. So one area of the brain could participate in any number of other activities with other areas of the brain, and in interacting with those activities will create what I would call a fractal attractor. They create a dynamic in there. Disparate parts of the brain work in concert to orchestrate the mind. Now, the interesting thing about that is if we're talking about an area of the brain that has a discrete function, we're not seeing what the brain really does. But if we talk about the relationship among the various parts of the brain and how that relationship creates a kind of field, if you will, then we're talking about brain functioning. Then we're much more accurate. Now, that gets us into something else that's kind of interesting from Jungian psychology, and that is, could this possibly be what Jung was talking about when he was talking about archetypes? And we're going to have a few more quotations that will kind of tell about that in a minute. But if molecular dynamics are able to influence behavior, even create behavior, and create perception, how does this happen? And have we ever seen anything like that? Well, of course, we're doing it right now. No question. We're doing it right now. Our brains, the molecules of our mind, are putting together our ability to speak, to hear, to understand, to elaborate upon what the speaker is talking about. But this happens at the most basic level as well. And one of my favorite areas is parasites. I talked about this on the other YouTube video, and you can go take a look at that and you'll see a little more about that. And one of my favorite parasites is a little parasite that can only reproduce in the gut of a sheep, which is a very kind of precarious situation for the parasite, because as soon as it procreates, it is excreted out of the gut of the sheep. So now this little parasite is kind of SOL because it's on the ground and it can't reproduce. It has to get back into the gut of the sheep. How's it going to do that? Well, one of the things it does is that it attracts slugs. It secretes, this parasite, gets the offal, if you will, the turds of the sheep, to be very attractive to slugs. And as I always say, this is yet another reason why we don't eat slugs. But at any rate, the slug comes along and eats the turds, and the parasite is now in the slug. Okay, step number one. So what does the parasite do? It changes the slug's slime so that it becomes very attractive to ants. And the parasite is in the slime, and the ants come along and they eat the slime. And now the parasite is in the ant. Not a bad deal. But ants love to crawl on the ground. I don't know if when you were a kid and you lay in the grass and you saw the little ants, it was sort of like there was this jungle, and underneath were all the natives running around, all little ants. Ants don't like to go toward the sun, but the parasite changes that. It changes the ant to want to get close to the sun. And what's the closest to the sun the ant can get to? The tops of the grass. Who eats the grass? The sheep. And the parasite is back in the gut of the sheep where it can reproduce again. And there are a number of things about that that are pretty interesting. One, that's an incredible amount of analysis of the situation, thought about what to do with the situation. It's probably more adaptive than I could ever be. But there's nobody home in the parasite, or is there? Well, if there's a psychoid realm that we're talking about, then yeah, I guess there really is. The second thing that's very interesting about all of that is that it's all oriented toward reproduction. It's all oriented towards reproduction. And Jung was once asked, is there anything in the human animal that is just absolutely the bottom line of what it's about? And he said survival. Well, Freud had a slightly different view before him, which was sex. And sex and survival are probably the two biggest motivating factors of all living things. Some that aren't even living, actually. Now there's a very interesting fungus that can only reproduce when it can't travel. It can reproduce, but it can't travel. And what it does is when it gets into ants, it gets ants to go up trees. And when the ants get to the top of the tree, they die. And the fungus is then emitted from the carapace of the ant and falls to the ground in a different spot, and it has traveled. So if you want to study parasites, be prepared for some nightmares when you sleep at night, because they're very, very interesting. And the most interesting parasites, from my perspective, are viruses. Viruses, as we know, are not alive. They're closer to rocks than they are to people. They just don't. There's nothing living in a virus. It's just a section of DNA, and it can't replicate itself, except by using somebody else's replication machinery. So the challenge for the virus is to be able to go from replication machinery to replication machinery. So how does it do it? How's it going to do that? Well, one way it does it is by, when we get sick, we tend to cough and we tend to sneeze. And out comes the virus on our hands. Then we shake hands with somebody and the virus gets into the next person. This is why we're always told to wash our hands and after we shake hands with people, to go and wash our hands, because a lot of stuff gets communicated through that. So in his conclusion to the article on synchronicity, Jung says this: we must completely give up the idea of the psyche being somehow connected with the brain, and remember instead the meaningful or intelligent behavior of the lower organisms, which are without a brain. I wrote that, how many years ago? 60, 70, 80 years ago? He was onto something, He observed, as did a lot of people of his age, because remember, Jung wanted to be a zoologist. That was his real desire in life, but you couldn't make money as a zoologist, so he became a physician. And he became a zoologist of the mind, basically. And he saw all of these little organisms that were acting highly intelligently. And he said, they don't have a human brain, so intelligence really cannot be a function of the brain. And then he also said in the same conclusion, it's hard to see how chemical processes can ever produce psychic processes, or how an immaterial psyche could ever set matter in motion. In other words, how can matter transcend itself? And now we're going to get into the main point of what I want to present to you tonight and what we'll be doing all day tomorrow. And that is how our minds function before the ego is up and running, and what the effect of that is on us throughout life. Because it doesn't stop. It doesn't just end. It's always there. So we can learn a lot from early childhood learning. For example, children learn from birth. We've all heard of the studies recently that were done that discovered that in the first 2 weeks of life, the cry of a child, of an infant, imitates the language around it, the cadence, the tone, the tenor, the rhythm, the sine wave, the frequency, that kind of thing. So that children in France tend to cry more like French. Children in Germany tend to cry more like German in 2 weeks. Okay? Here's something else. A lot of psychologists have been doing violation of expectation studies with infants. And some of these examples are you have an object that passes through another. So for example, I would take this microphone and I would create the illusion that it was just going, right through the speaker. And what they discover is when they do that, the infant looks at it longer than otherwise. The infant's sort of like monitoring and suddenly sees this and focuses on it. So the psychologists are saying, aha, they're picking up on that. They're seeing something that doesn't coordinate with what they expect. Or there's an object floating in midair. And the finding is that infants look longer when their intuitions about the world have been violated. Their intuitions have been violated. What intuitions? Whose intuitions? So what one psychologist is doing is saying, okay, it's intuition. The children have intuition. Okay, fine. So they realize this is wrong. The child is clearly not sitting there going, well, that doesn't make any sense. That shouldn't be the way it is. It just happens. Okay? So agency is attributed to intuition. Other psychologists attribute it to neural systems, innate biases, perceptual causality. So here's an interesting quotation, and I want you to start thinking, what does this have to do with Jung? And then I'll tell you, but you'll already know. Human beings are profoundly social animals. This is from an article called The Biological Basis of Social Interaction in Current Directions in Psychological Science. Human beings are profoundly social animals. The success of social interaction depends on the development of brain systems that are geared to processing information in the social domain. Much cultural learning from elders and peers has to be acquired for social skills to be honed. However, without the existence of neural systems that are geared to process social stimuli right from the start of life, it would be difficult to explain the universality and speed of social learning. What are they talking about? They're talking about archetypes. It's exactly what we say archetypes are. As Jung said, archetypes are contentless forms. They are aspects of the psyche prepared to receive information from the environment and sort it out in a way that improves the adaptation and survival of the organism. They're talking about archetypes. Here's another quotation. We are prepared for learning. In this view, innate biases have evolved for ecologically important stimuli. A perceptual shortcut to identifying some causal events is useful precisely because it alleviates the need to reason about what makes these events causal. So I want you to think about the child, the infant, and the very young child who has an archetypal predisposition to experience things in certain ways, to categorize them, if you will, in certain ways of which the child is unaware. The child doesn't know that the child is doing this. It's just happening. And it creates shortcuts to understanding what's going on in the world for a child who cannot reason it out. In other words, our minds are up and running, reasoning, coping, coming up with solutions, coming up with perceptions on things before the ego is formed, before we know it's happening. That's the psychoid realm. It is not just a repository in the mind. The psychoid realm is an active, area of the mind that is working as a kind of consciousness before consciousness is formed. This area allows identification of causal events without the need to think about why these events are causal. Now, okay, if this is what's going on in the brain, if this is what's going on in the mind, who or what is doing the learning? And if there is something that's up and running, what could we look at that might really give us a clue to the remnants of this thought process in adult life? And of course, one of the things I've studied extensively is trauma. And we all have. In fact, I think that all the diagnoses in the DSM-4, soon to be 5, can be boiled down to 2. Post-traumatic stress disorder, because every one of us has been traumatized. Everyone. I mean, we've even talked about birth trauma. And I've always said that the worst mistake I ever made was not going back inside as soon as I saw where I was being born into. You know, I mean, it was great in there, and I was taken care of. I had all the food I needed. It was nice and warm and moist and quiet. And I came out into this world, and oh my God, what the hell is this place? So the birth trauma. So every one of us is traumatized. The other diagnosis I would say is the organic brain syndrome. So everything that is a mental illness is either a product of something wrong with the hardware or something that's been encoded in the deepest layers of the mind, there to continue acting throughout our lives. And that's what we're going to look at. I think it's a very interesting thing. I think trauma exemplifies how experiences become encoded in the brain. And where do they get encoded? In the hippocampus. The hippocampus here is the area that is basically known to be responsible for memory. And the amygdala is the area that's pretty much known to be the location of fear. And what I hypothesize, and it is a hypothesis because we can't prove it yet, although there's a guy named Joseph Ledoux who's written a book called The Synaptic Brain. If you're interested in all of this stuff, that's a really good book to read. He says that what goes on here is that traumatic experiences get encoded in a kind of very strong relationship between hippocampus and amygdala. So fear and memory get connected very powerfully. Now, if that's the case, and we're looking at this kind of a situation where we end up having flashbacks in our lives, which means any small element of the original trauma will reconstitute the whole trauma in all of its effect. We're talking about a dynamic that is stuck in an oscillation, and we'll talk about oscillations in a minute, and those of you who've read Archetypes and Strange Attractors know that oscillations are the whole point, that there's an oscillation going on here that is a sterile oscillation. It just doesn't go anywhere. The fear keeps reconstituting the original experience. What's the solution to that? To connect it to the frontal lobe, to connect it to another part of the brain. Because one of the things that is very interesting is that the more highly complex the functioning of the brain, the more areas of the brain are involved in it. So we want to get more areas of the brain involved in this traumatic memory, if you will, or reverberation going on in the psychoid unconscious. It's what we do in analysis. That's the whole point of analysis. And one of the things we'll talk about tomorrow is that most psychotherapy takes this hippocampus amygdala consortium here and brings it into the frontal lobe. In other words, we are taught to think about it. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, DPT, dialectical processing therapy, DBT, I don't even remember what that's called, but anyway, all of these therapies, every year the med school gives us a reception once a year to thank us all for being on the clinical faculty, which means we volunteer our time and services and we get to call ourselves clinical faculty. Clinical faculty are always volunteers. And they always have the latest therapy there. And there are always a bunch of us old guys in the back of the room who just sit back there and grouse. You know, we've been doing this for 40 years. You know, they're calling this isn't new. I mean, they're just taking one part of it. But what they all have in common is we take the unconscious stuff, bring it into consciousness, and process it. Great, excellent, needs to be done. But it doesn't really transform anything until consciousness goes back into the unconscious and lives there. See what I'm saying? We have in most therapies today a movement from unconscious to conscious. What we do as Jungians, we go from conscious to unconscious through, among other things, active imagination, which is what we're going to do tomorrow. We're going to do a lot of active imagination tomorrow, but it's not going to be the heavy kind of stuff. We'll do that too. It's going to be quite different, and I have some examples of it that I'll show you that I think are a lot of fun. So in Archetypes and Strange Attractors, I tried to demonstrate how chaos theory illuminates Jung's structure and dynamics of the psyche. In Clinical Chaos, the next book that just came out last year, I extended that to integrate some discoveries in brain research with all of that and to give clinical examples. It's case study after case study after case study. So in self-organizing, non-linear physical and chemical systems, interactions are typically shaped by multiple feedback loops, including positive ones that amplify emergent dynamics and negative ones that modulate and constrain them. From such inner conflict, organization can seem to arise spontaneously from disorder. One of the big principles of Jung's metapsychology is tension of opposites. It's part of that old Germanic, European, dualistic philosophical system that Jung was raised in, but it's accurate. The whole mind operates in tensions of opposites, oscillating systems, and we'll get into that in just a second. Can we have the next slide, please? Here's where I think the rubber really meets the road. This is the formula that produces fractal attractors. This is the chaos formula here. And this is how it goes. We have a quantity here, y. This is the initial value of y. What we do is we create a formula that has r and 1 minus y, okay, when y is between 0 and 1, so it's a fraction. So when y increases, 1 minus y decreases. In other words, this formula is in tension with itself. And what we do is we take the value of y and we plug it back in to the formula again, and we run it again. And we take that value and we put it back in. That's what this is. This is always completely referring things back to where they were before. The speed with which we run this equation is this. So as this value oscillates as it's fed back into the equation, the intensity with which it oscillates produces fractal attractors. So basically, we're talking about a lot of chaos stuff, things like sensitive dependence on initial conditions, the butterfly effect. You've probably all heard about that. A butterfly comes to flight in Beijing and disturbs the atmosphere, and in disturbing the atmosphere, it then creates a turbulence pattern that as it comes across the Pacific Ocean works on itself, gets bigger and bigger and bigger until suddenly here in Seattle we have a rainstorm. You know, sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Trauma is like that too. Childhood trauma creates a reverberating dynamic that expands and expands and expands throughout life until we actually go back and take a look at it. But we can't go back and take a look at it directly because it's not conscious, and it never was. And everything that was worked out in the psychoid realm. So as Jung said, it's that psychoid realm. You can't view it directly. We have to do it indirectly. We also have things like feedback loops. This is a feedback loop here. We take whatever we've got here and we feed it back into the equation, feed it back into the equation. Everything is a feedback loop in the body. Everything. So, and we'll get into that in just a minute. So some of the oscillations and bifurcations we get in the body are protein folding. Are any of you familiar with protein folding? Anybody here know protein folding? Here's how it works. DNA gets converted to RNA. DNA is a double helix. One side of that helix gets peeled off as a template to make more things. That is called RNA. RNA then gets developed into everything that we are, everything that is chemical in us, everything that's physical in us, our bodies, our minds, everything is a function of proteins folding in a certain way. And they fold in an oscillatory tension of opposites way, because some parts of the protein are hydrophobic. They avoid water. They will not be close to water. Others are hydrophilic. They love water. Depending on which parts of that little stretch of RNA are hydrophobic and hydrophilic, it folds. And when it folds, it creates eyes, faces, arms, legs, enzymes, hormones, neurotransmitters. All of it is protein folding. The way the body develops, in other words, how is it possible that when two cells come together, we get fingers, we get legs, we get eyes? How does this happen? It happens out of a tension of opposites between excitation and inhibition. And what happens is, as the body develops, certain molecules get excited to move in a direction. Other molecules are then inhibited from doing that, and in so doing, we get the formation of shape, morphogenesis. This is as opposed to a molecular switch. Here's something to put in the back of your mind with regard to autism spectrum disorder. One of the things that we, and I'm using editorial we here, I have not done any of this research. I've just read about it in other people, but we, as a human race, have discovered that GABA, the gamma aminobutyric acid that is a part of the whole molecular compound of the body, acts as a switch in the mind. And before birth, it has to act in a way that gets things going. And as soon as the person is born, it has to act in ways that stop that. It goes from excitation to inhibition. If it doesn't work right, we tend to get autism spectrum disorder. And it has to do with what's called the chloride switch, which regulates what the GABA does. And it can be reversed by another chemical that's really beginning to show its mettle in the whole thing. So GABA's effects are excitatory during prenatal development and become inhibitory at birth. And then we have synaptic dynamics, and this is something that's very interesting to us, and then we'll kind of wind this up. Next one. Here's a nerve cell. Well, here's a schematic of a nerve cell. And we have, the body of the nerve cell, and we have the nucleus and the cell body here. And then we have these things called synaptic bulbs. And these are the little tendrils that connect with other nerves. And everything in the nervous system is a function of synaptic biochemistry. Next one, please. And here's a picture of a synapse. Here's an axon. This is the end of it. And here, this is one nerve over here. This is another nerve over here. And in this little synaptic cleft here, there's a whole bunch of transmission of neurotransmitters going on, little chemicals. And they have these little, what we call transporter proteins. They're like little trucks that take it from one side to the other. One of which is a kinase called KIF17. If you're ever interested in KIF17, it tends to improve intelligence. So if you are feeling as you age, go to your local drugstore and ask them for KIF17 and see if that will help you out. What happens is, as the signal input comes and the neurotransmitters, these little dots are neurotransmitters, are sent over to the other side, there are receptors here that receive them. They can't get in if there's no receptor. And when they get in and occupy a receptor, the receptor sends a signal back to this nerve and says, okay, that's it, we're full, thanks, we got it. Now, one of the things that chemistry says today is that if you have serotonin that's kind of left in the cleft here because the receptors have said, okay, that's enough, don't secrete anymore. And it gets just kind of retaken up into the basic germ plasm of the brain. It tends to make people have low self-esteem and be depressed. So we have developed what are called SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which then say to the receptors here, okay, even though you've received enough, we have to create a chemical soup here that doesn't let these things get taken up too much, because if they do get taken up too much, people are going to be depressed. So they inhibit the reuptake, and then people aren't depressed anymore. Right? No, it doesn't happen. They feel better, no question about it. But somebody comes to us because they're depressed because she's a woman and her husband is beating her up every night. Well, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor doesn't do much about that. She's still getting beaten up every night and she gets depressed anyway. So we have a situation here where we have a feedback loop. This feedback loop is what keeps the mind working. Tensions of opposites, feedback loops, the whole 9 yards. And what happens when we get these feedback loops going at a high R factor, remember that formula that had the R, when there's an R with its intensity going very high, we get a fractal attractor. We get what basically is a pattern in the ongoing dynamic of the mind. Now we can have the fractal attractor. This is a fractal attractor here, which I am shamelessly connecting with the book that I wrote. This right here is a graph of that equation that I had earlier. This is a computer-generated graph, and it's actually a slice of a 3-dimensional graph. And this is what it looks like. And a couple of things that are very interesting about this are, obviously, it's beautiful, you know, but all of these represent directions in which the formula is going. Millions and millions of different directions. And we call these things here basins of attraction. And if we want to say, okay, what's the line between this basin and that basin, so we, magnify, 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 there is no line. What we get is this original configuration again. Now, when we're dealing with the deep unconscious, we're dealing with stuff that doesn't resolve. It does not resolve into some sort of conscious demarcation of length and width and depth and time. It just doesn't do that. So when we're looking at a fractal attractor, what we basically have to do is interact with it so that we begin to oscillate with it. And when we begin to oscillate with it, then we get a higher R factor and things begin to move. Why is that important to us? This is important because of this. What time is it? Oh, good, we're right there. It's important because in working with trauma, working with our own trauma, this is what happens. We get a dynamic working in the unconscious that has developed as a result of the adaptive qualities of our mind that were up and running before consciousness was. So if I'm born into a highly disordered environment, or one that's not even that highly disordered, I'll pick it up. I pick it up immediately. We even know now that children in their sleep pick up emotion around them. There have been studies of this. They're doing fMRIs on kids and see, oh yeah, they're picking it up. So if mom and dad are fighting and the kid is asleep, they're picking it up. So what's happening is we have within ourselves, in the psychoid realm of the psyche, an element, a dynamic, if you will, that monitors the environment, analyzes the environment, perceives it as a threat, and adapts. When we get to be 6 or 7 years old, something like that, and we begin to kind of adapt on our own, oh geez, it's kind of crazy around here. I think, maybe I should do something. Maybe I should, get away when mom and dad are fighting. And I'm aware of this. They're fighting, conscious, all of that kind of stuff. This other stuff doesn't go away. And what we slowly do in life is we develop the cognitive, rational, ego-oriented way of dealing with life that splits itself off from and separates itself off from the unconscious, irrational, usually emotional, disruptive way of dealing with the original challenges that the psyche faced. We have two centers of consciousness really working against each other. If we try to dampen down or reduce or eliminate the disruptive effects of that original adaptation mechanism, we are alienating ourselves from ourselves. And yet I submit that that is what most psychotherapy does. How do you manage your emotions? How can you become aware of your emotions and keep them from intruding upon your life? Now, all childhood trauma has as part of it isolation, alienation, and disruption of relationship. That's the whole point of trauma. It disrupts relationship. So what do we do to solve the problem of this stuff re-emerging in our lives when we get into a situation and we essentially have a flashback situation, and we don't even know it's a flashback situation because we don't remember the original situation. But that's what it is. What do? We alienate ourselves from it. We destroy the relationship with it. We add gasoline to the fire. We do exactly the wrong thing. And there are very, very few psychotherapies that say, no, what we have to do is embrace this stuff. We have to be for ourselves what was missing originally in the beginning. And there's no way we can understand it. There's no way we can grasp it. We're not even going to try. We're not going to try to rip this stuff, pull it into the consciousness, into the ego, and deal with it there. We're going to take the ego and we're going to go back in. And when we go back in, we are going to transform and heal that part of ourselves by doing for the first time what never happened. And it all is consistent with brain chemistry, and it all is consistent with brain topography, and it's all consistent with chaos theory, and it's all consistent with trauma theory. And this is what we do routinely over and over in analysis. And this is what creates transformation and healing. The two-way street that in Jungian analysis is one of the few places where it exists, where we bring things into consciousness. Oh, you dreamed about a car. Tell me, what are your associations with cars? Well, you know, a car, they move, they have four wheels. Oh, really? Okay, that's very interesting. Maybe the dream is trying to portray something that is of that ilk, something with four wheels. Okay. Now, when you leave the session today, notice your relationship with cars. Take a look at the first car that comes into your purview and just think to yourself what that car is saying to you. Now, most of us would lose our licenses in front of the psych board if they knew we were doing that, but that's what gets people involved with the unconscious, and that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Next slide, please. It all is a little bit like this, though, however. And this is one of my favorite Sidney Harris cartoons. It's in the Clinical Chaos. I don't know if it's an archetype. It probably is. These two scientists are looking at this formula, and in the middle of the formula is the phrase, "Then a miracle occurs." And the one person points to the other and he says, you know, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. And that is, again, the problem with the work we do. We have this, then a miracle occurs. The psychoid realm adjusts to the conscious realm, and the conscious realm adjusts to the psychoid realm, and things get better. We've seen it over and over in analysis. It's amazing how often it happens. It's amazing how it happens. So we'll end with a poem. And one of my favorite poets, because I can understand him, which most poets I can't, is Rumi. I really like Rumi because Rumi writes things that I can understand. I grew up in a town called Sodus, New York, in upstate New York. And one of the men who grew up in that town was John Ashbery. Any of you know John Ashbery? Went to my church. I cannot understand a word he writes. He's considered one of the best poets we have today. Published all over the place, New Yorker all the time, poet laureate. Can't understand a thing. Rumi I can understand. This is called The Guest House. This human being is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still Treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the sham, the malice. Meet them at the door, laughing, and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from the beyond. That, to me, is a beautiful poem about the psychoid realm and what it does. That area where matter transcends itself, where matter becomes psyche, where body becomes mind in that dynamic interface of oscillations and feedback loops and chaos. Generally, chaos is not viewed very positively by our society. It's equatable with ambivalence, confusion, uncertainty, impotence. But it is exactly the opposite. When we enter into that realm and when we allow ourselves to reverberate with all of this crazy stuff that doesn't make any sense, then things begin to move and things begin to shift. That's what we're going to do tomorrow. So for those of you who have the courage to come, it's not going to be that at all. We're not going to have any kind of, difficult, ridiculous nonsense type stuff. We're going to have a lot of fun tomorrow. So come tomorrow prepared to engage in active imagination however you like. If you like to draw, bring some crayons, bring some paper. If you like to drum, bring a drum. If you like to dance, come in your dancing clothes. Because what we're going to do is we're going to go crazy. We are going to go insane. We are going to allow ego consciousness to go into the unconscious and there to just simply experience what is. Because that's what life is. Life is just unconscious. I mean, everything we do is 90% unconscious. And the more comfortable we are with that, the easier it is. And I'll end with one last vignette. The second time I went to Sri Lanka to work in the war zone, I was absolutely terrified. I made the mistake of having a book by Michael Ignatieff with me about what was going on in the world and an article about what was going on in Sri Lanka. And I'd been there the year before. And the kind of torture that I was experiencing there was Hindu-Buddhist torture, which I understand people of the book torture, Muslim torture, Jewish torture, Christian torture. I get that, it's very cognitive and very directive. But Hindu-Buddhist torture was a whole different thing. And it was just weird. And I was scared to death. And I almost thought when I got off in Singapore to get the plane to Sri Lanka that I was going to come home. I was like, why do I do this? This is ridiculous. I have a family, I have a life. What am I doing? It's crazy. And I suddenly thought, it's a dream. It's a dream. Treat it like a dream. Treat it just as you would a dream. Just, things are happening. You're part of it. So I got off the plane, and of course, Sri Lanka is like a dream. I mean, the food, the smells, the sights, the sounds are completely different. I was just having a wonderful time. And at one point, I was under mortar fire for like 16 hours. And all I could think was, man, this is really interesting. They're not shooting at me, and nobody ever dies in a dream. I mean, talk about dumb, talk about stupid, but it got me through. So learning how to deal with the craziness of the unconscious will get us through life situations that cognition would never be able to do anything with. So that's what we're going to play with tomorrow. I hope to see you there. We'll start at 10 o'clock, and I hope that tonight I've given you something to think about, and I hope tomorrow we'll have a good time. Thank you. Thank you. Questions?
So I was drawn to what I shared with you about the tagline of this lecture that was in the announcement about the event horizon of the mind, which we didn't hear about, but it was very present in the sense that event horizons, certainly in black hole physics, are a place where both relativity and quantum physics are pertinent, but they both give contradictory answers. They're necessarily a place in which the instruments just don't read anymore, which we heard in different ways in here again about there's an uncertainty domain in which it's hard to find the edge where the psyche and the soma meet, or, and in other paradigms, it seems like the same sort of frustration prevails. So I'm just curious how the event horizon came to be part of this.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And as you were talking to me in the break, you know much more about it than I do. So thank you very much for deferring to me and letting me act as if I know something about it. The event horizon is something that most of you would recognize as being connected to our analysis of black holes. So if you're familiar with black holes in the universe, what they basically are is they are areas of such massive gravitational force. In other words, the stuff there is so dense that even light can't get out. So where it looks like there's nothing, there's actually more something than anywhere else. So the event horizon is that point at which we can't perceive anything beyond it. So everything that we know about black holes is done by inference and may or may not be accurate, but it's a fascinating thing. And I think the psychoid area of the mind is like a black hole. In other words, the unconscious is where the greatest density of activity exists. It really is the ego cork bobbing on the ocean of the unconscious, and there is an event horizon there that we just can't cross. We can't get anything out of it except the images that it produces, and then in interacting with those images, we then can become part of the dynamic that produced those images, which is also the dynamic that produced us. And in that resonating, oscillatory, chaotic manner, a new configuration comes into being. And that's the whole point of what we do. So thank you for asking that question. Yeah?
I want to, I get a lot of what you're saying, I mean, sort of conceptually, or at least it, works on me in some way. I guess what I would like to see if you could offer me, when you say we go, let's see, the thing is to go out and get conscious of some of the trauma or the thing that happened and to actually, think it out and get to something. And then you say, but what we need to do is go back in. And then do something that should have happened at the point. Can you give an example of doing something that should have happened at the point?
Sure, yeah. Thank you. The question is, when we become aware of the presence of an unconscious dynamic at work in us, and it appears, it becomes something that we can't ignore. And I talk about going back in and working with it as opposed to trying to section it off and get rid of it. How do we do that? As with everything in the unconscious, through metaphor, through symbol and metaphor, as if. And do any of you remember John Bradshaw? And John Bradshaw used to talk about inner child, and he would have people kind of be the inner child. He was really onto something, I thought, but I do take exception to being the inner child. That, to me, is the difficulty to begin with. That what happens is that from these early childhood traumas, which not all of us have really had, or not all of us have had them in such force that they're problematic, but many of us have. One patient I've worked with, lots of residual stuff from childhood trauma, but a very crazy family. And I said to him, actually what you needed to do when you were 1 year old was leave home. That would have been the most adaptive thing you could do. He said, I did. I said, what do you mean? At 1 year old, they found him crawling out of the house, going to the house next door, And it was like that whole psychoid realm. I was like, we're out of here, and that was one of his problems. He's always out of here. So, and it was bothering him, and he tried to, not be out of here. And I said, no, you got to embrace that. What you have to do is treat it as the child you were, and welcome that child, and embrace that child, and tell that child that it's totally acceptable. And what a lot of my patients do, which I'm sure a lot of you have done too, is get a picture of ourselves at that age and carry it with us. And when we start feeling, whoa, it's like, oh, you're here. Oh, great, come on. No problem. And to be for ourselves what we didn't have then. A source of solidity, a source of security, a source of ongoing connectedness. Because the brain and everything in the body work according to relationship. It's all relationship. So when we talk about anything with regard to the brain particularly, there's no place in the brain where this is. It's the relationship among various elements, no one of which may have anything to do at all with this. It's the relationship that creates the phenomenon. So by engaging in relationship and bringing relationship to the relationship, the transformative element does get to work because it oscillates and it starts to interact and, you know. So thank you, good question.
Okay, well, thank you, that was great.
But my area of study and writing is on the evolution of consciousness and where we're evolving to. So I'm really curious what you think, you know, 'cause you're looking at this relationship between conscious and unconscious and going back into and the whole active imagination process. I'm wondering what you think the even larger effects that can have on changing this psychoid unconscious realm. Like, because if we're now engaging and interacting with it, are we now changing it itself? And both the unconscious and unconscious worlds are evolving and changing. And have you kind of delved into those ideas? And
Okay.
just
So,
looking forward and how consciousness is evolving.
and are you asking how we might recognize that change, or
Yeah, or just changes
or what it would
maybe
be?
you have seen and just in your practice and
Okay.
patients. And
Okay, good. Yeah.
I'm just kind of throwing some ideas out there, but I'm
Okay.
curious what you think about all
I'll
that.
see what I can do. The question is with regard to this psychoid realm and when we engage it and change it, transform it, so to speak, what does that look like? How is that happening? And how do we find ourselves changed? And how do we perceive the changes in the psychoid? Again, the psychoid is a dynamic. It doesn't change. So the psychoid doesn't change, and consciousness doesn't change. What changes are the contents, or the various fractal attractors, if you will, that develop on the interface between conscious and unconscious. So dreams are probably one of the places where Jungians have really seen this happen a lot, where we have a dream, and then we do some active imagination with the dream. And then we have another dream, and the dream begins to move on. And we have another dream, and it begins to move on. Where I really have experienced this most dramatically, because things have to be pretty dramatic for me to see them. I'm very obtuse, so I'm not really good with nuance and subtlety. You know, I'm half Dutch, a quarter Swiss, and a quarter German, and you know, I mean, there's no subtlety or nuance in any of those people, so I'm totally doomed. And living in Olympia is tough. You know, I grew up on the East Coast, you know, where it was all in a Dutch community. You know, I mean, my father, who owned a canning factory with his brother and brother-in-law, was in charge of production. And one day he was telling the women who were picking the rotten cherries off the belt as it moved along that maybe they could talk a little less and concentrate a little more on the cherries. And one woman turned to him and said, "Don't tell me what to do, Johnny Van Eenwyk. I changed your diapers." I mean, that's where I grew up, you know. So then I lived in Chicago for about 20 years, and you know, people were, you know, a little kind of put off by my East Coast Dutch, German, Swiss. But boy, when I moved to Olympia, the Pacific Northwest. Have any of you ever heard a singer called Baby Gramps?
Oh, yeah.
You know Baby Gramps?
Yeah.
You ever heard the song "Let the Rain Settle It"? This great song about how all these people I've been, well, just let the rain settle it. Let the dust comes up, let the rain settle. I mean, like, people in Olympia, you know, I mean, they either love me or hate me. So where was I going with that? Okay. But I digress, which we will see tomorrow. Remember that phrase, but I digress. It'll be funny. So to make a long story short, nightmares is where I first really experienced this shifting of the psychoid. Because the thing with nightmares is they are usually trauma produced. And we're talking a lot about childhood trauma tonight, but adult trauma will do the exact same thing. I mean, if we have a huge trauma in adulthood, it'll influence our reactions. For several years, if I heard a helicopter go overhead, I mean, I would just be like freaked, and my wife would go, "Oh, yeah," and I'd be like, "Yeah, right," because I've had some very negative experiences in various places of the world with helicopters. So, nightmares. one of the interesting things occurred to us in Gaza. The first time I went to Gaza, I was working with a Palestinian psychologist there who was actually quite interested in Jung. And so he and I really hit it off. Ahmed Abu Tawahina. And Ahmed and I, to this day, are great friends. I can't get into Gaza anymore, so we're not able to work with each other, but you can't go in through Egypt, and Israel has learned not to let me go into Gaza, because when I come out, I talk about what I saw in Gaza. They don't like that. So to make a long story short, Ahmed and I are working together, and this family comes in. And the little boy, who is like 10 years old, is waking up every night with nightmares at 2 in the morning, usually around 2 in the morning. And because, you know, in Gaza, everybody's poor, they live in one room. So everybody wakes up because the kid is screaming, and they don't know what to do. They can't comfort him, and they're all wide awake, and they're all sleep deprived, and they're terrified of the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers. They don't go out during the day. Nobody's going to school. Nobody's going to work, nothing like that. They're just completely paralyzed. And what can we do? And Ahmed and I are like, I don't know. I don't know. So we say, well, you know, we need to consult with each other. So we're talking with them. Well, what are the problems here? First of all, the family's totally isolated from each other. What could they do together? Okay, number 2, they're not going out because they're so afraid. So the whole family's traumatized. And of course, everybody is traumatized there, so that's not an unusual phenomenon. So what can we do with this nightmare? Why don't we have them come up with an ending? See, we kind of figured that the problem with nightmares is we wake up before it gets to play itself out. And nobody ever dies in a dream. Are you aware of that? Has anybody, you've been to Zurich, has anybody else been to Zurich? When I was in Zurich, by the way, I did not graduate from the Jung Institute in Zurich. That's something that Darryl Sharp puts on the books because I knew him there. I was the first graduate of the Chicago Jung Institute. So you know, I came back into the control stage there. So just to make that straight. So, when we were in Zurich, somebody once said, you know, if you die in a dream, you die. And we were like, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. A bunch of us, you know, would just absolutely keep ourselves asleep while we were dying in a dream. You know, like car accident, falling out of a tree, you know, any number of these things, these dreams we have where we're going to be killed. And none of us died. You know, we would hit the ground and we knew we were dead. And everyone around us would be, oh my God, they're dead. And we'd be like, I'm not dead. We realized, no, you never die in a dream. So this works very well in nightmares. Nobody ever dies in a dream, and nobody is permanently disabled in a dream. So we said to the family, okay, tell you what, when he awakens tonight, you come up with an ending to the dream that you like. Well, the dream was always the same. It was that the Israeli soldiers were breaking in and killing everybody. And the problem with that was happening in Gaza. So it wasn't just a dream. It was a replication of what was going on. So, but that was beside the point. So at 2 in the morning, he wakes up, he's screaming, oh my God, the Israeli soldiers came, they're killing us all. And so the family goes, okay, let's pretend we're all invisible. So they say, okay, here's the dream, everybody's invisible. What happens next? And they go, well, the soldiers are confused and they think they're in the wrong place and they leave. Perfect. The next night, no nightmares. Kid sleeps through the night. Great. You know, Ahmed and I are celebrated as, you know, the wisest psychologists in the world. Third night, nightmares are back. Of course they're back. You know? And so this time they decide that they're going to pretend in the dream, okay, so the Israeli soldiers come in and they shoot us. But it's a dream. Nobody dies. And they get really frustrated and they leave. Wow, you know, and then night after that, no nightmares. And so this went on and on. But the nightmares, of course, didn't necessarily go away because it's not a situation there that's conducive to nightmares going away. But the thing that happened was the family started to consolidate. And they lost their fear of the soldiers. And they started going out during the day. They started going to school. They started going to the shop. They started going to work. Their waking life was completely transformed because the psychoid, you know, had shifted into the mode of a new reality. And it was a reality. I mean, in Gaza, if you turned a corner and soldiers were walking at you and you freaked out and ran, you would most likely be shot. But if you just walked by them like, well, who are you? I don't know who you are. They'd leave you alone. They realized you weren't up to anything. So the conscious reworking of the unconscious by going back into it and experiencing it and coming up with a different way, but playing with the dream, actually settled down the kid, settled down the family, and changed the waking reality of the family. Wow. So that's how it works. And this is what we do. And we do this in analysis all the time with our own dreams and our own fantasies and that kind of a thing.
That's awesome.
Other questions?
Yeah, just had a question about the point you were describing where when the child supposedly was sleeping and it was reacting to kind of the information that was in the environment. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of like mirror neurons. You know, they're saying that we just react, our brain starts firing in resonance with kind of what's going on. But the thing I was thinking was,
Are you all familiar with mirror neurons? Why don't you just
oh,
say a little bit about it? Yeah.
well, I'm not a biophysicist or neurologist, whatever, but mirror neurons, they found are neurons that are in our brain, and when, say, a child is doing something, just in the environment, and the parent is actually, say, doing a particular activity where their brain lights up in a particular pattern, where the activity is in a particular pattern, and certain parts of the brain are lighting up, that no matter what the child is doing, whether it's paying attention or not, those parts of the brain are lighting up as well in the child's brain. So it's kind of like they call them mirror neurons, because no matter what the child's doing, it's just mirroring, the same brain activity and pathways that is going on in the parent nearby. But I guess my question and thought was, that would seem to infer that when the child kind of comes into the world, it's really it seems to be immersed in kind of the parent's stuff, as being very, very receptive and undifferentiated. It's just getting molded by, I guess, all of the parents' conscious and unconscious patterns or things like that. So I guess my question is I guess they could be influenced by the negative, but they also could be influenced by the positive. That seemed to make sense. Okay. So I would think that when you said that when you have to go back to the unconscious to face kind of what's there, to be present, that in a sense it would seem like in some ways you'd be going back and encountering something almost historic, because that process would have been going on for generations. So in fact, it would seem that when you're going back and facing the unconscious, you're actually, I guess, theoretically exposing yourself and working with material that may have been going down through your family line through generations. Is that kind of something you can comment on?
Sure. Thank you. Great question, and good explanation of mirror neurons, which I don't really understand either. But well, actually nobody does. But they are nerves that light up in things like empathy, when we're kind of resonating very well with somebody else, where we see ourselves reflected in them, so to speak. Jung talked a lot about the question you're asking, and he felt that there was a history to every family that would come out in the children of succeeding generations, and that it was very important to kind of know the collective history of the family lines, because of course they multiply as you go back and all of these various things. So then the question becomes, is some of the stuff that we encounter in our unconscious left over from previous generations, like maybe 4 or 5 generations back even? Yeah. The example I had of that was a woman who came to me because her husband wanted her to see me, and I was seeing the husband too. And so I saw each of them separately. And she was a person who could not really maintain relationship, but of course she was very attractive. So she had marriage after marriage after marriage, which incidentally, that's an interesting thing about statistics. You know the statistics that more than 50% of the marriages end in divorce? Some people are responsible for 4 and 5 of those marriages. So it's not 50% of the people who get married and the divorce, it's 50% of the marriages, and some people are really racking up a lot of stats on that one. And she was one of them, and she was really terrified of her husband. Every husband she'd ever been married to, she was terrified because as soon as they got angry with her, she would just freak. She couldn't do it. And we looked at it, and we didn't find much of anything. And we talked to her, what about your parents? And I said, well, just look through your family history, would you? And so she was talking to her mother's sister, who was still alive, and said, is there anything in our family history that would indicate that, I'd be afraid of violence? She said, well, didn't you know about your great-great-grandmother? And she goes, no, I didn't know about my great-grandmother. Well, she said, your great-grandmother was the sole survivor of the family when the father killed everybody. And then he killed himself. And he killed everybody with a ball-peen hammer. And if you look at old pictures of her, if you have it, you'll see there's a dent in her forehead. But he thought he'd killed her and he hadn't. She was the only survivor. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a thing, right? And that was then, this is now. But it sure does make you think. It sure does make you think, what gets passed on from generation to generation, and especially with traumatic circumstances, deep traumatic circumstances. We know, for example, that a lot of our problems are our parents' fault, and we know that a lot of our children's problems are our fault, and fault being the fact that it's just who we are. And it can happen in groups. So you're probably familiar with children of Holocaust survivors. And when I was in Chicago, my wife is Jewish, so a lot of our friends were Jewish, and there was a woman who ran a group in Chicago for adults who were offspring of Holocaust survivors. And what they had all discovered at B'nai B'rith and Hillel and stuff like that was that they weren't able to sustain relationship. They'd get into a relationship and it would just break, and they were all getting together like, what's going on? Why can't we have relationships? And they all got together and talked about what it was like growing up in the family of a Holocaust survivor, most of which were incredibly successful. The survivors had gone into business, done very well, the families were very happy, they were very active, engaged. And what they realized was in every one of their families, there was a strong emotion, at least one, sometimes two or three, missing. It wasn't ever there. So in some families, there was never anger. No one ever got angry. In some families, no one ever cried. There was never a tear shed. And what had happened was that the survivor had essentially just sectioned off an aspect of their functioning that would bring them back to something that was so horrific that it was not functional, and just be done with it. And so the kids had grown up without being exposed to these kinds of emotions. So they'd be in a relationship with somebody and the person would get angry with them and they'd totally freak out. They had no idea what to do. They'd never experienced that. Oh my God, you don't love me. Or the person would cry and they'd be like, oh my God, this is terrible. You're crying. Everything was overdrawn in the way that the emotion that was connected to the Holocaust experience was overdrawn and had been suppressed. And this happens. So there's a lot of stuff going on, some people think, Jung, I think, felt that some of it was inherited. It actually came through with the DNA. And when we think of things like genetics and what is now known as epigenetics, and genetics being genes and alleles and chromosomes and DNA, RNA, proteins, that the epigenetics is the chemical soup in which this stuff occurs. It doesn't just happen. Even the stuff with the synapses and everything, it's all in a big chemical soup. And the chemical soup actually has an enormous effect on how RNA is converted into proteins and all of that. And it is also heritable. So not only are genes and DNA inherited, but so is a lot of the epigenetic chemical soup stuff, and we really don't know how that happens. We don't even really know that soup very well, but we don't even know how it happens. But Jung felt that a lot of stuff was just inherited. It came through. But I think, too, that we all create a kind of psychological world that we live in, and that psychological world is characterized by certain things and other things are just missing. And kids pick up on that. My kids certainly did. My kids, they picked up on my shadow all over the place, and my wife's shadow, and the shadow of our relationship. And they even did things that were sort of instinctual, that were part of creation myths, which, my wife and I were like, what is that all about? So, for example, you may have heard the old creation myth that said that at one time, Father Sky and Mother Earth, and in some cultures it's Mother Sky and Father Earth, were so close together that nothing could live. Life could not form. And trees grew and pushed sky and earth apart, which created room for animals and peoples. And this is why we revere the trees, unless we're Weyerhaeuser, which we revere them in a different way. But at any rate, make a long story short, our daughters, from the time they were able to walk, if my wife and I embraced, like I come home from work, or she came home from work, or we were just wanting to embrace, immediately one would come right up in between us. And then the two of them would come up in between us. They were terrified somehow of us being so close together that there was no room for them, So we'd pick them up, we'd say, oh, we're gonna have a family hold, and we'd look at each other like, are we ever gonna have a sex life again? When we talk about parasites, one of the things I said in Portland was, children are parasites. They really are. I mean, they live off you and they alter your behavior, and yeah.
Well, can I ask a question about, when you mentioned that the brain is composed of towers of neurons, that was very useful for me. I've been thinking more about that. Supposing our consciousness and our ways of behaving and thinking are caused by, or somehow they reflect the structure of our neurons, then what directed their structure? How did they decide how to form this way and not that way? What is it that caused them to go in one particular shape or another? Are they pursuing glucose or something over in this region, or what is it?
That's a great question. Do you understand the question? The question is like with neurons and even growth things, when we talk about excitation and inhibition and things, what gets them to go in a particular direction? Well, the answer is glial cells. Okay, next question. It's impossible. We really don't know, but it is glial cells. We figure glial cells and astrocytes are part of all of that, and don't ask me what they are because I really don't know. I mean, I'm a total dilettante at all of this. I'm not someone who really knows what he's talking about. But I've developed a demeanor over the years that gives people the impression that I do. So it sells. But that's what they say: astrocytes and glia cells. And what it basically means is that there's a kind of chemical signature that the nerve itself is somehow attracted to. It somehow engages the excitation element of the nerve cell, and it does move towards that. So it's like if we wanted to look at the brain and we'd see all of these little like beacon lights all over the place and nerve cells sort of sailing towards the beacon lights. That's kind of the metaphor that is being used these days. But that's a great question, because if you can answer that question, you can really make huge steps to creating life in a test tube. And that's something that's also being pursued, which I'm sure you're all well aware of, is the whole point of how do atoms and molecules become life? What has to happen in order for that to occur? We think there are things like carbon and phosphorus and oxygen, and these things have to combine in certain ways. And then lightning comes, and lightning. We don't know. So it's a good question. But what we're trying to do in Jungian analysis is to facilitate whatever process exists there. We actually, a lot of the stuff that I talked to you about, I find fascinating, but we don't really need to know it, because what we're interested in analysis is the result, the process and the result. We don't really care that much what the actual chemical signatures of it are, although I find those fascinating. I just find that people once said to me, or someone once said to me, do you read science fiction? I said, no, I read science. And if any of you belong to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, if you don't, you should, because every week you will get the most fantastic science fiction you've ever seen in your life, and it's all science. It's all what's going on in science at the moment. Materials science, biochemistry, some psychology, genetics, and it's absolutely mind-boggling how everything is put together. It is so complex. But yeah, good question. One more, then we'll quit. Or we'll just quit.
Sorry, I'm taking turns. What the story you just shared about the grandmother and with the
Yeah.
broken hammer, it something that's been really fascinating for me, whether it's the sins of the fathers or persistence through the DNA or addictive patterns, any number of things in which something seems to persist. I got very excited in encountering entanglement in physics, and entanglement not only across distance but down generations. And so I hope that you take a curiosity and an interest in it at some point.
I can what?
I hope that you take an interest in it. I would love to hear anything you discover if you ever cross that way. I know you've kind of steered clear of the physics. You stayed more focused on chemistry and biology, but it seems like for me, physics also has a lot to offer in this.
Oh yeah, physics does. Physics has a lot to offer, right? But I'm bad at physics. I'm really bad at physics. I didn't do very well at elementary physics in college. And years later, I was sitting next to a guy who worked at the Argonne Labs out in Illinois with high energy physics. And I said to him, well, I really admire you. I said, I could never understand heat and work problems. He said, of course not. He said, nobody understands those. He said, you just memorize it, get through it so you can get to the good stuff. And you've probably heard of Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was one of the few physics professors who would teach introductory physics because nobody else would teach it because you don't understand it. The most elemental aspects of physics, I think, are the hardest to understand. But I'd love to do that for you, but I really can't. I'm sorry. Okay, right. Okay, thank you very much. One other thing. If you're coming tomorrow to the workshop, which I strongly hope you do, wear comfortable clothing. I mean, this is going to be. Any of you ever remember the Mickey Mouse Club when you were kids? Yeah. There was a time in my life when Jimmy Dodd. Remember Jimmy Dodd?
Oh, yeah.
Why? Because I knew he was the only guy in the world who liked me. I watched it every day because somebody said they liked me. I couldn't believe it. Wow, that's so good. God, Jimmy Dodd, what would I do without Jimmy Dodd? But anyway, they had something called Anything Can Happen Day.
Oh, I remember.
Remember? Strictly choreographed, but it was called Anything Can Happen Day. Well, that's what it's going to be tomorrow. It's going to be Anything Can Happen Day, because if we're really going to do this, we're not going to do this as sort of conscious people. Dun, 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 dun. We're going to go a little bit wild. We're going to go a little bit berserk. And not in any way that's going to embarrass us, but just in the way that we're going to cut loose from a teleological, goal-oriented approach to this. And we're going to do it more finality, because Jung said that the psyche and psychic energy is not teleological. It doesn't go to a goal. It just goes here and there and here and there and here and there and here and there. And that's all we can know about it. So that's what we'll do tomorrow. So be comfortable. Bring whatever you want to do to sort of play with the various images we're going to look at. And bring images. Bring a dream if you want. And we'll do your dream. If you want to. One of the things that's fun, I run a dream group in Olympia. It's been going for 20 years. People know each other really well at this point, and we always treat the dream as our dream, not your dream that we're on, but it's our dream. What does the dream mean for us? And boy, is that fun. We have a great time. So we're going to have fun tomorrow. Okay? Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.